Everyone was interested in having ever increasing and better relations with India, which we could then use to extract good terms, concessions. Everyone wanted to be on good terms with India. All the Western countries were very keen on supporting India's G20 agenda. India has relied on the idea of positional power, that we are a swing state and all great powers want us on their side. And that is our power and leverage. It's like if your old investments are decreasing, we need to make new investments, and hence we need a new story. My only fear is that India should not alienate this new political force in Nepal that has just emerged.
So, hello and welcome to the HT podcast. I'm your host, Shashank Matu, coming to you from a very cold and rainy day in Washington, D.C. But I'm coming to you because there is a interesting topic that we need to discuss. For the last 3 or 4 years, if you've been paying attention to Indian foreign policy, there has been one concept that everyone has been talking about, which is India's sweet spot. India's foreign minister has talked about it, scholars and intellectuals have been talking about it. It's the idea that everyone essentially wants to be friends with India. Everyone wants a piece of India geopolitically. But in a controversial and extremely well argued new piece, Sidharth Raimedhi of the CSTR argues that in fact India has lost that geopolitical sweet spot, and the world moving forward is going to be a lot more challenging, a lot more difficult for India to navigate. Sidharth is also an old friend, so welcome back, Sidharth. Can we start talking about what you basically wrote in this article? You say that India had a geopolitical sweet spot for the last 2 decades that ensured that the world around it was much more friendly to India's interests, and we've now lost it. What's going on here?
Right. That is exactly right. We did have a sweet spot based on various factors, but the very short version is that the US invested India as a future strategic partner, as a counterbalance against China. This incentivized China to show restraint and to also be more conciliatory towards India to prevent the coming together of US and China. At the same time, until recently, Russia also had a hedging approach towards China, which required it to invest in the relationship with India, both as a restraint on China and also as an insurance policy in case its relations with China went to a downturn. So this was the basis of a sweet spot, which meant that everyone was interested in having ever increasing and better relations with India, which we could then use to extract good terms, concessions, in order to enhance our own status and power in the world.
Right. So, if I'm getting you correctly and just reading from your piece, you basically say that that sweet spot that India had lasted between 2001 and 2019. And basically, the bedrock of that was that India's economy was growing. And so, America wanted a piece of India, it wanted to reset its relationship with New Delhi. And so, it did the India US nuclear deal that improved the India US relationship. You had China that basically realized that India's economy was growing and that it wanted a stable, predictable relationship with India. It also didn't want to push India too close to America, as you were saying. And also, everyone else in the world was also much more interested in India's growth story, wanted to cooperate with India and build that relationship. Could you tell us a little bit about this sweet spot? What benefits did it bring for India? Did we actually use that sweet spot well over the last 20 years?
Right. So that's exactly right. That everyone wanted to be on good terms with India, which really meant that there was a high acceptance and a willingness to understand and even tolerance of India's uh, occasional quirks, let's say, right? One very core concrete example is that because of the sweet spot, back in 2018, India could buy and purchase a Russian S-400 defense system, and India was still gain an exemption from the sanctions that the US wanted to put on any country that had bought the system. Now, if you recall back then, the Defense Secretary James Mattis basically went around explaining the rationale for that, which is that we are building a long-term partnership with India. So please overlook, he was speaking mostly to Congress and the Senate, please overlook this seemingly odd decision of not buying a US system and going for a Russian system. This is still, the importance of this still pains in comparison to the long-term dividends that we are trying to achieve vis-a-vis India. This is one example, and so is our G20 diplomacy in many ways, right? All the Western countries were very keen on supporting India's G20 agenda because it wanted to curry favor with India. It wanted India to recognize and acknowledge such a contribution. And hence, that is another example. Furthermore, what the most common example is that we are members of both the Quad, which is seen as a containment strategy vis-a-vis China. At the same time, we are members of the SCO and BRICS, which is seen as a strategy to discipline or the US unipolarity or US unilateralism, right? So we are able to kind of hunt with the hound and run with the hare, so to speak, right? So we are able to use Russia and China to ask US to reform some of its international institutional approaches, and at the same time we have common interests with the US that we then leverage vis-a-vis China. So these are some examples of how we benefited greatly from the sweet spot.
Right. And you're saying now that that sweet spot has vanished. That era of, good times has gone, and we're in a much more competitive world. So, what exactly changed? I know from your piece that you've talked about the 2020 Galwan clashes that took place between India and China on the border, killed several Indian soldiers. That was a big turning point. And then the Russia-Ukraine war was also a big turning point in India's relationship with the Western powers, which had been courting it sort of endlessly for the last 2 decades. What exactly happened? How did we lose that sweet spot?
Yeah, that's right. So I think Galwan was key, and more so in retrospect, it was not evident then for two main reasons. One is that it highlighted the limitations of the India-US strategic and security partnership, because despite a lot of fanfare and publicity and positive ties, it became evident that the US was incapable of mitigating or solving India's problem vis-a-vis China at the Himalayas, right? So it kind of did weaken some of the rationale of closer India-US strategic ties. The second thing that Galwan did is that it drew India's focus towards the Himalayas, the LAC, and it led to a shift in focus from balancing China and wider Asia through the Indo-Pacific or Quad towards escalation management and control in cooperation with China, right? So it was very necessary for India to have a stable, predictable, manageable relation with China so that the continuing Galwan impasse or standoff did not deteriorate into further conflict. And if anything, we wanted China to cooperate with us in resolving the Galwan standoff, which meant that that you needed to have more stable, less confrontational policies vis-a-vis China. So that I would say weakened, unknown to us again, some of the reasoning or the basis of the sweet spot.
Right.
Now, the Russia-Ukraine war also occurred within 2 years of that, and very simply, what it did is that that a lot of the sweet spot was driven by a certain romantic view in the U.S. of the value of India strategically. There was this idea that India-US relations are so increasingly positive that it is now time for India to help the US diplomatically vis-a-vis Russia. But given how India was very keen on maintaining ties with Russia, understandable reasons, it led to a new realism in Washington and US more broadly, the policy establishment, that maybe the bets that was made on India in the early 2000s, that if we develop ties, we'll get certain strategic dividends, then that was a little bit perhaps naive. And so that also weakens the sweet spot to a certain degree. These are the two ways in which both Galwan and the Russia-Ukraine war both worked from different ends to corrode some of the sweet spot.
Right. And it's very interesting that you mentioned, Galwan to begin with, right? Because I remember Galwan happening, and the immediate sort of reaction was a great deal of popular anger against China. And I felt that also one of the key reactions that you saw across the Indian government, the military establishment, the foreign policy establishment, was this view setting in India that China is a strategic rival, a strategic competitor. I felt up until that point, there were still people who were willing to argue that this is a relationship that can be cooperative, this is a partnership that can deliver dividends. And after that, you sort of saw those China optimists sort of die out. And would you also say that Galwan was also one of those turning points that solidified the fact that, after 2 decades of reasonable peace, stability, and cooperation, the India-China relationship is back to one of competition, of rivalry, of China backing Pakistan, as we saw in Operation Sindoor, and that is going to be a much more difficult security reality for India on its northern border. Would you agree with that?
Yes, so that is the case. So even I was a consultant at the MEA when Galwan happened. So now, yeah. So there was I would say even I kind of thought that was quite possible. Remember, there was this article called "India will not be bandwagoning anymore." That now the balancing is real. I think the idea behind that was that China had finally shown its true face, right, at Galwan. And this was all that was needed for India to take the final jump into deciding that this is a strategic adversary and threat. And the informal meetings at Wuhan and near Chennai was kind of betrayed by China, and that too in the middle of a pandemic. So obviously the anger was very understandable and very high. But what I think everyone kind of missed is that Chinese threat became very evident, and hence the expectation that India's hard policy is also going to be evident. But Chinese power also sprinted far ahead than we had thought. And this is not just India, even the US is now adjusting to this realization that the policy infrastructure that it has had, be it external alliances, defense, economics, to be able to manage the rise of China was insufficient, has been insufficient. The US is realizing it now, India also, in a way, over the last few years. So states balance against power not just because they have done something bad. The question of power asymmetry is also key. So just when China has shown its aggressive intent, it has also been able to establish that it is no easy matter to adopt, let's say, a quid pro quo approach towards China. And hence, we did not go into Chinese territory the way, let's say, the Indian army is trained conceptually, for instance, in 1965, right, vis-a-vis Pakistan. That would have been too risky. And hence, initially, there was a lot of anger and purpose. But I think over time, prudence, pragmatism started chipping away in that. And it was a recognition of power asymmetry to a degree as well. And hence, the effect of Galwan, I would say, is still continuing and it's still going on. And it will perhaps into the imminent future as well.
Right. Let's talk about that question of the West as well. The second factor that you cited, which is the Russia-Ukraine war. And again, we were there. We remember a lot of the debates that were taking place about India not condemning Russia, and it really did at one point in time. When you speak to diplomats, they tell you that look, those conversations with Europe and America were very tense, very confrontational at particular points of time, and it took a lot of time to get Western countries to sort of accept that India's policy was what it was going to be, and that India was not going to give up its relationship with Russia. But you're saying that actually that has led Western countries to essentially reassess how useful India is going to be as a strategic partner going forward. And they'll have to say that, look, we have to accept that there are limits to what this partnership is going to look like. And that means that we also have to subsequently invest less in India that we've been doing over the last 2 years, two decades. Would you agree with that assessment as well?
This last part, invest less in India, yeah, or yeah, I would agree with that. So again, I agree with all of the reasons that the government gave, and you and I also did go around defending that position when we were in our visiting program in Europe. So but the problem is this, in the sense that the more if you clarify it too much, in a sense uh, that I have no choice due to both ideology, let's say strategic autonomy and identity, as well as some legacy issues, dependence on the Russian military and all of that. You're also signaling to the other side that that do not woo me beyond the point. It will not work, right? That is the whole idea of bargaining and negotiating. You people play with each other's hopes for a long period. But because the attack on India diplomatically was so strong, our defense was also equally strong. And it is just unfortunate that in that conversation, there was a byproduct, which in retrospect is more clear. The byproduct is the US mainly revisiting older assumptions about the fundamental nature of India US and the fundamental expectations that they can have from each other. And Ashley Tellis's essays are, I would say, the best intellectual representation of that calibration of expectation from India.
Right, and that essay basically arguing that, I mean, the headline again, which he says wasn't his, was that America has made a bad bet on India. That if you expect India to align with you to the level that they're an ally without really calling themselves an ally, you are in for disappointment, and we have to take a much more realistic, perhaps even more transactional view of the India-US relationship. So you're making that argument that essentially we are in a position now where the Chinese see India as a competitor. They've shown that in Operation Sindoor when they provided military and intelligence support to Pakistan. And our relationship with Western countries has been strained somewhat because of Ukraine and the fundamental realization that India has its independent foreign policy. It does not align with the West beyond a particular point. So where does that leave us exactly right now? Um, does it leave India in a reality where it is in a much more difficult position foreign policy wise? What does that mean moving forward? What does it mean really when you say that India has lost its sweet spot? What can we not do now that we were doing before?
Right. So one takeaway is this, that over the last few decades, to wait in various degrees, India has relied on the idea of positional power, that we are a swing state and all great powers want us on their side, and that is our power and leverage. But now we need to move into a new understanding of power, which is that positional power gains will have only diminishing returns, and hence now power will have to be understood in a more traditional sense, that this is about economic power, economic leverages, military power, which means economic reforms, defense reforms, right? Old school traditional basis CNP of power. So that is the first takeaway, in a sense that we have to return to a home-based strategy, in this sense that we can regain the sweet spot if we show a lot of domestic growth and potential again. We did not touch upon it earlier, but there has been growing skepticism of India's manufacturing record of the last few years, economic growth rates, and all of that. So demonstrating a lot of that at home will be a significant way to reboost our geopolitical sweet spot. The second, and I think the government is understanding some of this. So there is increasing talk of domestic reforms. The Prime Minister Modi has spoken of it. We've seen how quickly GST got simplified and rationalized. And I will expect that there will be more addressal of those issues in the coming years.
Right. I think this is very interesting that what you mentioned about the economy as well, because I think once you wrote the piece, I called you up and I said that, look, this is very, very interesting. And I think that it's I think a point that bears repeating as well, which is that a lot of the logic for countries wanting to align with India was, and you hear this a lot in DC, that India is the next China. India is where the growth is at. And this is a country that we want to align with and get much closer to. But if the Indian economy slows, then India's attraction as a partner diminishes as well. And so, in addition to what we've seen with the West and what we've seen with China, if India's economy slows, then we're really in for a difficult spot. When you talk to people, when you travel, you talk to folks in the Western world as well as China. What exactly are they thinking about India's economic growth story? The government says there's still some juice. There is growth. It's just a lot of global headwinds. Other people have raised much more difficult structural concerns about the Indian economy. So, when you talk to people abroad, what exactly are they saying about the Indian economic story?
Yeah, so it's a similar story of over optimism and now overcorrection, right? The same as expectations from the US about strategic partnership. So I think and also the Indian economy did have significant positive markers and achievements. It is still the fastest growing democracy and all of that. But I think there's been a shift from just being satisfied with that headline news kind of an analysis, fastest growing, large middle class, growing middle class, all of that. There has been increasing a deeper look into some of the bases of Indian economic health and power, right? And hence the stagnant manufacturing is noted more and more. There have been also there have been decreasing investments, FDIs, into India over the last few years. I think these are stories that Indian audiences are also more and more aware of today. And also when the tariff threats had occurred, when Trump imposed those tariffs, there's a lot of conversation as to if China could negotiate with the US by threatening to cut off the supply of rare earth, Is there also something up India's sleeves, a coercive countering element? And I think the consensus has been that that we don't have as strong a leverage as a Chinese economy vis-a-vis the US. So I think overall, based on my conversations and simply going through media reports, there is a growing skepticism towards India's economic future as well. There's more and more conversation on unemployment and stagnation in job growth and salary growth and all of that. So, and hence that has fed into the idea that the idea that India could emerge as a manufacturing alternative to China, as well as attractive middle class, a growing middle class with higher and higher purchasing power. And in my view, if India manages these two over the coming few years, that you start developing supply chains domestically, manufacturing, and you start increasing the purchasing power of the Indian middle class, both through expansion as well as higher purchases of quality goods. I mean, that will really go a long way in bringing back India's quote unquote mojo in the global world space.
Right. So we'll talk about recovering India's mojo in a little bit, but I just want to ask you two questions. The first one is on what we've seen over the last couple of weeks with Donald Trump and really the nosedive that the India-US relationship is taking. Now, as of this recording, things seem to be getting slightly better. Very limited understanding seems to be reached between India and the US. We've seen both countries making positive statements. But how do you see the last couple of weeks, what we've seen with the 25% tariffs on buying Russian energy, um, and just some statements that have come out about from the Trump administration, the public hostility towards the United States now in India. Where does that leave the India-US relationship, and how does that fit into the analysis that you're making about the India-US relationship becoming much more transactional, and therefore much less reliable for India in the long term?
Right. So that's a great question, and it's very tricky. And I mean, answering it, I might be repeating some of your own observations because I've been relying on you for the insight in Washington. But my own sense from here is that we need to make a analytical distinction between U.S. grand strategy shift, which is more long term, which is more understandable, predictable, and the personality of the Trump administration, right? So starting with the latter, which is, I think that, and I've argued uh, towards this previously, that President Trump may not be as interested in the containment of China as previous presidents, including himself during his first term. There are many reasons behind it. And recently, there has been a leak of the Pentagon upcoming national defense strategy, right? And according to the leak, the UN wants to pivot from containment of far off threats such as Russia and China towards protecting the Western Hemisphere, which is securing borders, going after drug traffickers. The recent attack off the shores of Venezuela is used as an example, right? Now, again, we don't have to immediately fall for that. This may be a bait to China as well, so that China she picks up the call and agrees to a summit with President Trump. But till the time that it lasts, what it means is that India's value that as a counterbalance to China is almost non-existent, if not very, very low for the Trump administration. Which then, and also the US bet and investments since 2000 in the relationship, from trade to space to modular reactors, education, people to people, the whole breadth of it, right? That it seems this Trump administration does not really care about too much. It's willing to throw that under the bus in order to get immediate benefits, whether it be being able to take credit for operations for the ceasefire of May 10th, or to be able to show to his domestic base and the Europeans that he is being tough on Russia by being tough on India, right? And hence, we are in a very bad position vis-a-vis the US because of the fundamental interests and worldview of the administration.
And I think that what I really enjoyed about your piece was I think that you had a very different approach from a lot of people talking about this issue, right? Because when you see people talking about, oh wow, our relationship with America has suffered a great deal, the answer is, among some people at least, is that no, let's work to restore our relationship with China, reduce hostility there, try to align more with Europe and other countries, improve our relationship with Southeast Asia. And I think that you argued that look, what was really interesting about your piece was that you said that, look, that is secondary, right? Stop playing these positional games of, if America does this to us, we will move closer to Russia and China. If Russia and China do something to us, we move closer to America. The answer really is, you need to grow economically. You need to fix your defense forces. You need to modernize more quickly, because if you don't get that equation right, what you do with Russia, China, and America is just going to be much less important. Your view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one reason also that reinforces that is in my conversations with Western interlocutors, one very alarming idea that has come about is that they think a lot of Americans now think that India's future intent is uncertain, or it could be inimical towards the West, which I entirely disagree with. This is, and again, I think actually telling
And is it because we go to things like BRICS or like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? Was that what triggered that?
I think it's triggered by a comparison. There is this narrative of India moving towards authoritarianism. There's some of the controversies related to extrajudicial measures in foreign countries, and hence there is this almost there's this urge to compare India as the next China, not economically but politically, and in terms of anti-Western orientation, right? Whereas I always disputed that. I do not think that India will ever take an anti-Western position. And our Foreign Minister Jaishankar has been trying to emphasize the point. Non-Western does not mean anti-Western, right? Um, but the positional games sometimes reinforces that even further. The fact that India projects that we can swap friends and partners that easily for a week, even let's say, or a month, it only amplifies the concern of those who are now, because they're jaded, but because of the China investment, that we build this Frankenstein's monster in China due to naivety and mistakes since the 1980s. Are we doing the same with India? Now, you can't go back in time and fix the China mistake, but what you can do is not make the supposed hypothetical mistake that you're making now. So that is one of the reasons. The other thing is that yes, the administration, also Trump administration, different officials have been calling it performative, right? Peter Navarro has been belligerent that we are not buying this and all. So that is in a way what I anticipated as well in the piece, that you can that this will not lead to the dividends that you're imagining, and hence India will have to go back to dealing with each great power on terms, on their own bilateral terms more and more. So with the US, if your entire rationale for improving relations was that we're both democracies and that the China threat is a common threat, given that the Trump administration may not see China as a long-term threat or rival, or India as a viable answer to it, even if it was, then you need to have a new rationale, a new purpose for this relationship, right? It's like if your old investments are decreasing, you need to make new investments, and hence we need a new story in a way,
Right.
which will already as a old story, but it will still be enough to continue the momentum of a lot of significant cooperation that has been built over the many years.
Right. Could I ask you then two final questions just to close out in terms of what we do now? Because you've painted a fairly stark, and I remember reading this piece and saying, wow, that is bleak. But the more I read it, the more I realized that there is a lot of merit to the arguments that you are making. There are diplomats that I've sent your piece to who have sent this, and they say, yeah, it's we are in a challenging position that is very different from where we were just this time last 2 years ago, because that was when G20 was happening and everyone was very upbeat, very optimistic about India's foreign policy, about its position in the world, and a lot of that is a lot more uncertain now. So let me ask you two questions to close out. Number one, what do we do exactly at home? If you had a top three items agenda for what needs to happen to strengthen India at home, because as you point out, these positional games of India, Russia, America, that is second. What you do at home matters. So what does India need to do at home?
I think the answers that I'll be mentioning are not at all novel. These are things we've known for many years. One is a second generational economic reforms to kickstart manufacturing, deregulation more and more, simplification of tax codes, creating more predictability for investments for a security. The GST was a great step, so that will anyway help. Yeah, reforms in land, labor especially, and creating that environment. So we need to pivot very, very strongly towards an impression rather than tweaks. Even in reforms, the danger is that we will just pull levers and tweak things here and there because of constraints, which are understandable, political. And in such a large country, you cannot move too fast without a lot of people falling off a Indian railway train, right? So that's an effigy that people carry also. So despite the risks, we there needs to be bipartisan, greater conversation, consensus uh, about what is in the Indian national interest. And there has to be a bipartisan political consensus also to back. And we used to have this a lot in the 2000s, be it on a nuclear issue or even the GST and other issues, right? That political parties would support each other despite small complaints here and there. Second is, of course, defense procurement reforms. We have not even touched upon the most acute security threat over the coming years, which is a Pakistan China cooperation and synthesis. Call it what you want. But that is the most acute security threat, I would say, that India has faced probably in a long, long time. So that will require increased military spending for sure. Reforms in the way in which we design, develop, procure armaments,
Mm.
and also increasing military imports because to mitigate against the losses of squadron strength that we are going through and all that. And the sooner the better. Ideally, it should have been yesterday. But these are the steps India needs to take, right? And
If could ask, what happens globally when you look at the fact that, as you're pointing out, this China Pakistan condominium is developing. China is providing what 80% of Pakistan's military equipment. There's a sense that they will transfer highly advanced military technology to Pakistan precisely because they want to contain India. At the same time, you see the Indian government trying to stabilize the relationship with the Chinese. At the same time, we're trying to ensure some level of stability with the Americans. This was again a country that we thought we would get closer and closer to as the years went by, as China's power grew, and we wanted to balance that power together. If I could ask you for a potted history version, a 90-second version of how we deal with these challenges and our relationships with China and America and Pakistan.
right. So with US, I think the goal is to reverse some of the damage, and if not, go back to the period of exuberance where we could easily talk about a golden partnership, but at least go back to having positive ties. So, and the US has always been very important vis-a-vis Pakistan. Uh, for instance, in 1962, the US played a strong role in restraining Pakistan from opening a second front. And if there is a crisis, maybe US will have to play or could play a role in facilitating communication, not a ceasefire. The given dispute, the present dispute problematizes that a lot, right? So that is a bad sign already. So repairing ties with US is very crucial. Now, with Pakistan and China, I wouldn't know about of a short term approach, but a more longer term approach is that I would call upon a more flexible form of diplomacy. So having positive talks and attempts at creating at least a perception of positive momentum in India-China relations does have its own role. I think a lot of the fate is that by attempting to achieve a better political understanding at the highest level between India and China, that itself could help us address this combination of China and Pakistan. So historically, countries wean away the smaller power from the larger. It's a wedge strategy. What India is doing is that we are persuading what we perceive as a more rational power, which is China, to limit its assistance to Pakistan. Uh, Thirdly, that over time there needs to be again some sort of a better dialogue and communication with Pakistan as well. Because if we are willing to undertake a transition, an economy transition, which we say we are, right? Then you need a more stable, predictable, immediate security environment, right? So it does not mean being friends with Pakistan or trusting Pakistan. No one in India is that naive anymore, anyway. But any form of increase in diplomacy just helps. in terms of limiting the incentive for cooperation, for limiting the incentive within Pakistan to try create misadventures in Kashmir or at the border. So diplomatically, India will have to adopt a more flexible approach vis-a-vis all powers, China, US, Russia, Pakistan, and domestically, of course, economic reforms and defense reforms.
Right. Let me ask you one final question, and I know I'm going back on my agreement because I said I'll ask you only two, but let me ask you one final question, taking advantage of our friendship. Tell me a little bit about the neighborhood and what happens now, because we've seen what's happened in Nepal. This is, of course, we're recording the day after KP Sharma Oli had stepped down as prime minister, and it really does seem like the neighborhood is significantly unsettled at this time. We see Sri Lanka continue to go through an economic crisis that India at least helped somewhat in. We continue to see a very strained relationship with Bangladesh. We've seen, again, what we've seen in Nepal. We've seen Bhutan, which is coming under pressure from China for a boundary settlement. And of course, Pakistan is what it is. Myanmar, again, a country that is in the middle of a civil war. So, again, in addition to all the problems that we have internationally, in the neighborhood, we have another very, very challenging set of circumstances. So again, sorry to put you on the spot again, but a potted answer, if you could, in terms of what do you think India's policy should be moving forward on the neighborhood as well, because we need to stabilize this part of the world as well for us.
Right. I think in India and in Delhi, there's always been this urge to have a neighborhood policy, and I myself might have argued for it. But I actually do not think that is possible because each country is so complex and unique in their own right that there needs to be simply better or more attention to each country in Delhi, right? And the relationship with each country. So, so re- there is. I don't think it's really possible to have a one broad sweep of a neighborhood policy, but there are certain instincts though still, and there are debates between those instincts. One instinct too is a sphere of influence and hence more assertive, emphasize hierarchy. The other one is conciliatory, pragmatic. I think what we've seen over the last few years is that India actually not doing a bad job in managing a gradual transition from the way of the 80s and 90s when India was actually pretty domineering in many ways. I'm not saying we're suddenly a liberal entity in South Asia, but now what, for instance, the key example is that we diversify our engagement in all these countries to the degree possible. Sri Lanka and Maldives are both the most stable partners of India today, not even Nepal, Bangladesh. And that is a product of our diplomatic flexibility, which is again what I was mentioning last time. We were able to engage with and build a stable, practical partnership with political parties who have been anti-India historically, right? I think that has an immediate implication for Bangladesh as well. And when the ouster of Sheikh Hasina happened, I also argued within a week that India's best bet is actually greater talks and cooperation with the Bangladesh National Party, BNP, despite the bad record when they were last in power from 2001 to 2006. Now, just coming back to Nepal, my only fear is that India should not alienate this new political force in Nepal that has just emerged. It's barely 4 days old, perhaps. A loose coalition of various students and organizations, right? So I think there has been a learning curve from Bangladesh, and hence Indian approach will not be to immediately criticize this movement or alienate it. I think it will be more careful than one might expect.
Right. Sidharth Raimedhi of CSTR sitting down with me here, explaining the reality that India had a geopolitical sweet spot over the last 15 to 20 years, and it now seems to have lost it, but also talking about what India needs to do moving forward, that is strengthening at home, reforms both in the economy as well as the defense process, and also laying out how India approaches its relationships with China, Pakistan, the neighborhood, and of course, most importantly, right now, America. Sidharth, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for our viewers for joining us here on HT Podcast.